Chapter 1. The Day Everything Changed. Jim Brown was an honest man. He worked hard every day in a small factory. He was not rich, but he was happy. His wife Mary cared for him, and his two little children made him smile when he came home. Life was simple and good. Jim often said, "We don't have much, but we have each other." Mary smiled and said, "That's all we need." One morning, Jim reached the factory as usual. He saw a crowd of workers standing near the gate. A man shouted, "The factory is closed. The owner ran away." Jim's heart stopped for a moment. He said, "What? Closed? That can't be true." Another worker replied, "It's true, Jim. No one has work now." Jim stood quietly. He felt weak. His job was the only way to feed his family. He went home slowly that day. Mary looked at him and asked, "You look pale, Jim. What happened?" Jim said softly, "The factory is closed. We don't have work anymore." Mary sat down and said, "Oh no. What will we do now?" Jim took her hand and said, "Don't worry, Mary. I'll find something soon." But deep inside, he was afraid. For many days he went out early and came home late. Every shop, every place he asked said the same thing. No job now. The money in the house was running out. Mary tried to save food. The children sometimes said, "Daddy, can we have more bread?" Jim smiled and said, "Tomorrow, my dear. Daddy will bring more tomorrow." But he knew he was lying. One night, Jim and Mary sat together in silence. She said, "You're trying hard, Jim, but nothing is working." Jim looked down and said, "I feel useless, Mary. I want to do more, but I can't." Mary replied gently, "You're doing your best. That's enough for us." The next day, Jim met his old friend Tom in the street. Tom looked well-dressed and happy. Jim said, "Tom, you got a job?" Tom smiled proudly. "Yes, in the new factory. I heard they wanted one worker, so I went first." Jim's smile faded a little. "You could have told me," he said softly. Tom laughed. "Come on, Jim, it's was just luck. Maybe next time you'll get one." That night, Jim told Mary about it. She listened quietly. He said, "Even my friend didn't care to tell me. Everyone is thinking about themselves." Mary touched his shoulder and said, "People change, Jim, but don't change your heart. You're better than that." Jim looked at his children sleeping. He said in a low voice, "I must find a way. I can't let them go hungry." Mary said softly, "You will, Jim. I believe in you." He lay down, but sleep did not come. His mind was full of questions. What if he never found work again? What if his children started to hate him for being poor? He turned and whispered, "No, I won't give up. Something will change. It has to." The next morning he went out again. His shoes were old, but his hope was still alive. As he walked down the road, he said to himself, "I'm still strong. I still have faith." But in his heart, he knew that life was about to test him in ways he had never known before. That day, Jim Brown's journey truly began. A journey not just to find work, but to find himself. Chapter 2. The Betrayal of a Friend. Jim woke up early the next morning. He looked at his wife Mary and their children still sleeping. He whispered to himself, "I must find a job today." He put on his old coat and walked out with quiet hope. Inside, he was afraid, but he kept moving. All day, Jim went from place to place. He asked again and again, "Is there any work here?" Every time, people answered the same way, "No work now, sorry." When evening came, his legs were weak, but his will was strong. He told himself, "Tomorrow will be better." The next day, Jim met his old friend Tom again. Tom looked different now. He wore a clean coat and shiny shoes. Jim smiled and said, "Tom, you look happy today." Tom laughed and said, "Of course I'm happy. I got a new job at the steel company. The pay is good too." Jim felt a little pain inside, but he smiled. "That's great, Tom. I'm happy for you." Tom said proudly, "They wanted one more worker, so I went early and got the job." Jim looked at him in surprise. "One more? You could have told me, Tom. You knew I was looking for work." Tom shrugged and said, "I needed it too, Jim. Times are hard. Everyone has to think about himself first." Jim's smile disappeared. He said softly, "I thought we were friends." Tom looked away and said, "Friendship doesn't pay the bills, my friend." Then he walked away without looking back. Jim stood there for a long time. He felt something break deep inside him. For the first time, he saw how money and fear could change people. He went home slowly, his heart heavy. Mary opened the door and asked, "Did you find any work?" Jim sat down and said quietly, "No, and I lost something more important. A friend." Mary touched his hand and said, "Maybe he was never a true friend, Jim." Jim looked down and nodded. "Maybe you're right." That night, Jim sat near the small table thinking. He looked at his rough hands and said to himself, "These hands worked every day, and now they have nothing to do." He remembered T. Alm's words, "Friendship doesn't pay the bills." His heart filled with sadness and anger. The next morning, Mary tried to lift his spirit. She said, "Don't let this hurt you, Jim. You still have us." Jim looked at her and smiled weakly. "Yes, Mary, I know. But I need to keep trying. I can't give up now." Later that day, Jim met another man named Paul, who used to work with him. Paul said kindly, "I heard about your factory closing. I'm sorry. It's bad for everyone. But I know someone who needs strong men to carry boxes at the dock. You should go there." Jim's face lit up. "Really? Thank you, Paul. I'll go right now." Paul said, "Be careful, Jim. The pay is small, and the work is very hard." Jim replied, "I don't care. I just need to earn something for my family." He hurried to the dock and spoke to the supervisor. "Sir, I'm looking for work. I can lift, I can carry, I can do anything," he said. The man looked at him and said coldly, "We already have enough men. Come back next week." Jim begged softly, "Please, sir, give me one chance." The man shook his head. "Next week," he said again. Jim walked away slowly, his hope fading. He whispered to himself, "Next week." But how will we eat this week? His eyes burned, but he didn't cry. No, he said firmly. I will not break. I will fight. That night, Mary saw how tired he looked. She said, Jim, rest tomorrow. He shook his head. No, Mary. If I rest, the children will go hungry. I can't stop. Mary placed her hand on his shoulder. Then we will face this together, she said. Jim looked at her and smiled faintly. You're the only one who still believes in me, he whispered. He lay awake long after everyone slept. He thought of Tom, of Paul, and of his hungry children. He promised himself, tomorrow I will try again. I don't know where, but I will not stop. The night was silent, and Jim's world felt cold. But somewhere inside him, a small light of hope still lived. He didn't know it yet, but the hardest days of his life were still waiting ahead. Chapter 3: Empty Plates and Silent Nights. Days passed, but nothing changed. Jim woke up every morning before sunrise and walked through the town searching for work. He knocked on every door, but the answer was always the same. Sorry, not hiring. His heart grew heavier with every no. At home, Mary did her best to keep the children calm. She cut small pieces of bread so they would think their plates were full. One night, their little boy said, Mom, I'm still hungry. Mary smiled weakly and said, Tomorrow, sweetheart. We'll have more tomorrow. But when Jim came home, she whispered, There's almost nothing left. Jim sat quietly, looking at the empty plates. He said, I'll find something tomorrow. I promise. Mary nodded, but both of them knew the promise was only hope. That night, Jim lay awake, listening to his children breathing softly. He whispered to himself, They trust me. I can't fail them. His eyes burned, but he didn't cry. He had no strength left for tears. The next day, Jim went to the same places again. He waited near the factory gate, hoping someone would need a worker, but no one came. One man passing by said, It's no use waiting. The world has no work for poor men anymore. Jim walked away without answering. His hands were cold, but his mind was burning. He thought, how can a man work when there is no chance to work? He looked at the sky and whispered, Why is life so hard for honest people? When he came home, Mary was sewing an old shirt. She looked up and said, You look tired. Jim forced a smile. Just a long day, he said. She sighed softly. We'll be fine, Jim. We always are. Later that night, Mary took out a small box. Inside were the last few coins they had. She said quietly, We can buy some bread for 2 days. After that, I don't know. Jim took her hand and said, Keep the money safe. I'll bring something before then. The next morning, Jim went to a nearby market. He saw people selling food, clothes, and tools. He thought of asking for small work, even if it was just carrying boxes. A shopkeeper said, I already have boys for that. Jim smiled sadly. All right, thank you, he said, and turned away. When he reached home that evening, Mary's eyes were red. She said, The landlord came today. He wants the rent. Jim looked at her helplessly. I'll talk to him tomorrow. I'll find a way. Mary shook her head. He said if we can't pay in 3 days, we must leave. Jim looked at his sleeping children and felt a deep pain in his chest. They have no place to go, he said softly. That night was long and silent. The children slept beside Mary, and Jim sat alone by the window. The room was dark, and his stomach was empty, but his thoughts were louder than hunger. He remembered his friend Tom, the man who refused to help, and his heart filled with anger again. But soon, that anger turned into sadness. He said in a quiet voice, Maybe this is how life tests us. Maybe this pain has a reason. He looked at his hands again. Strong hands, but with nothing to hold. I must not lose myself, he whispered. Before closing his eyes, Jim made a silent promise. Tomorrow, I will not come home empty-handed. He didn't know what he would do or where he would go. But one thing was clear. He would no longer wait for luck. Something had to change, even if he had to take a step he never thought he would. And so, in the stillness of that night, while his family slept in hunger, Jim Brown's heart began to change, from hope to desperation. Chapter 4. The Wrong Path. The next morning, Jim woke up with one thought in his mind. I can't let my family starve again. His heart was full of fear, but also a new kind of fire. He said to Mary, I'll bring something today, I promise. She looked at him and asked softly, What will you do? He replied, I don't know yet, but I'll find a way. Jim walked through the streets again. His body was tired, but his mind was restless. Every shopkeeper said the same words. No work now. He started to feel a heavy darkness growing inside him. Near the corner of a small road, a man called out, Hey, you look strong. Want to earn some money fast? Jim turned around. The man's name was Lewis. He looked rough, but confident. Jim said, What kind of work? Lewis smiled and said, Simple work. Just move some boxes tonight. No questions. Jim frowned. What's inside the boxes? Lewis laughed. You don't need to know that. You'll get $5 for 1 hour. Think about it. Jim's heart beat fast. $5 could buy food for his family for a week. He hesitated. Is it safe? He asked. Lewis said coldly, If you don't want it, I'll find someone else. Jim quickly said, No, I'll do it. That night, Jim met Lewis near the old storage house. He helped carry heavy boxes into a truck. The work was hard, but his mind kept saying, Just one time, just tonight. When they finished, Lewis gave him the money and said, Good job. Come again tomorrow. Jim took the money and walked home. Mary saw the notes in his hand and smiled for the first time in weeks. Jim, you found work? He nodded. Yes, something like that. She hugged him and said, I'm so proud of you. But inside, Jim felt empty. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't say that he didn't even know what he had carried in those boxes. The next night, he met Lewis again. This time, he noticed strange men watching from the shadows. One of them whispered, "Make it fast." Jim's heart began to race. He asked quietly, "What's in? The boxes tonight?" Louis looked angry. "Do your job and keep your mouth shut." Jim felt sick, but he kept lifting. After the work was done, Louis paid him again. Jim walked home, but his steps were heavy. When he reached the door, Mary said, "You look pale. Are you okay?" He forced a smile. "Just tired." That night, Jim couldn't sleep. He thought about the boxes, the strange men, and the lies he had told. He whispered to himself, "I did it for them, for my family." But a voice inside him replied, "Wrong is still wrong." The next morning, when Mary gave food to the children, she said happily, "Look, they're smiling again." Jim looked at them and felt tears in his eyes. He thought, if they knew what I did, would they still smile? Later that day, Louis came to his house. He said, "Good work last night. I have another job. More money." Jim looked down and said, "I can't. I won't do this again." Louis laughed loudly. "You think you're better than us? Fine. But remember, you still owe me for last night's silence." Jim froze. "What do you mean?" Louis said coldly. "You talk about last night, and everyone will know you were part of it." Then he left. Jim stood there, shaking. He realized he had fallen into a trap. He sat down and covered his face with his hands. "What have I done?" he whispered. When Mary came, she saw the fear in his eyes. She said softly, "Jim, what's wrong?" He looked at her and said, "Nothing, Mary. Nothing at all." But inside, he knew everything had changed. That night, as the wind whispered outside, Jim sat alone thinking. His hands that once worked honestly had touched something dirty. He whispered, "I will never do this again, no matter how hard life gets." And with that promise, Jim took his first step back toward the man he used to be. But his past mistake was not done with him yet. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The next few days felt longer than ever. Jim stopped working for Louis, but fear stayed inside him. Every time someone knocked on the door, his heart jumped. He worried that the police might come or that Louis might return. He kept telling himself, "I did it only to feed my children." But the guilt didn't leave. Mary noticed the change in him. She said softly, "You're quiet all the time, Jim. What's wrong?" Jim forced a small smile. "I'm just tired, that's all." Mary looked into his eyes and whispered, "You're not the same anymore." Jim wanted to tell her everything, but he couldn't. He was afraid she would hate him. Instead, he said, "I'll fix it, Mary. I'll find honest work again." She replied gently, "I believe you, Jim. I always will." One evening, the landlord came again. He said, "You still haven't paid the rent. I can't wait any longer." Mary tried to explain. "Please, sir, give us one more week." The man shook his head. 3 days. After that, you must leave." When he left, Mary sat down and covered her face. "Where will we go, Jim?" she cried. Jim stood still, his hands shaking. "I'll find a way," he said, but he didn't know how. That night, the children went to sleep early. Mary sat quietly, holding Jim's hand. "We've been through so much," she said softly. "But don't lose yourself, Jim. Promise me you won't do anything wrong again." He looked at her and said, "I promise." The next morning, Jim went out again. He searched everywhere, asking for work. At one place, a man said, "We need someone to clean the yard, $1 a day." Jim smiled for the first time in weeks. "I'll take it," he said quickly. He worked hard all day. His hands were sore, but his heart felt lighter. When he got his first dollar, he held it tightly. It was small, but it was clean. He whispered to himself, "This feels right." That night, he showed the dollar to Mary. Her eyes filled with tears. "Jim, this means more than money," she said. "It means you did, and give up." For the first time, they ate dinner without fear. The children laughed, and the house felt alive again, but peace didn't last long. The next evening, Louis appeared at the door. Jim froze. Louis smiled and said, "Missed me?" Jim whispered, "Why are you here?" Louis said coldly, "You think you can walk away from me? You owe me." Mary looked confused. "Who is this man?" Louis laughed. "Ask your husband. He knows me well." Jim stepped forward and said firmly, "Leave my house. I don't work for you anymore." Louis moved closer. "You forget, Jim. If I talk, everyone will know what you did." Mary looked at Jim in shock. "What is he talking about?" she asked. Jim lowered his head. "It was one night, Mary. I just carried boxes for money." Her voice broke. "You promised you would never do anything wrong again," Jim said quickly. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what was inside. I swear." Louis laughed again. "Such a sweet story. But remember, I control what people believe." Then he walked away, leaving silence behind him. Mary turned away and started to cry. "I trusted you, Jim." He tried to hold her hand, but she pulled back. "Please, Mary," he said softly. "I was desperate." She didn't answer. That night, Jim sat outside alone. His heart felt heavy like a stone. He said to himself, "I lost everything. My job, my friend, and now her trust." He looked up and whispered, "God, if you're listening, show me the way. I can't live like this anymore." The next morning, he woke with a strange calm. He said quietly, "I'll make it right." No matter what it takes, Jim didn't know where his next step would lead him. But he knew one thing: he couldn't fall any lower. From now on, his fight would not be just for survival, but for his soul. Chapter 6. A Ray of Light. The next morning, Jim woke up with a heavy heart. Mary had cried herself to sleep, and the house was silent. He sat for a long time, looking at his hands. He said to himself, "I have to fix what I broke. I can't lose her too." He went outside and started walking with no plan. His pockets were empty, but something inside him told him not to stop. Hours later, he saw a small notice on a wall. It said, "Help needed. School repairs." He read it again and thought, maybe this is my chance. He walked to the small school and met an older man named Mr. Adams. Jim said politely, "Sir, I saw the notice. I can fix things. I just need a chance." Mr. Adams looked at him carefully and said, "It's not much pay. Just $2 a day." Jim smiled. "That's more than I have now." Mr. Adams nodded. "All right, you start tomorrow." For the first time in weeks, Jim felt a small spark of hope. He went home and told Mary, "I got some work at the school. It's not much, but it's honest." Mary looked surprised but happy. "That's wonderful, Jim. I'm proud of you," he said softly. "I don't deserve your kindness." She shook her head. "You deserve another chance." The next day, Jim worked hard at the school. He cleaned, fixed broken chairs, and helped paint the walls. The work was simple, but he felt alive again. The children at the school smiled at him and said, "Thank you, sir." Their words made him feel respected again. After work, Mr. Adams said, "You did well today. You're a good man, Jim." Those words stayed in his heart. It was the first time in months someone had called him good. That evening, when he brought the $2 home, Mary smiled and said, "This is the beginning, Jim." He nodded. "Yes, Mary. The right beginning." Days turned into weeks. Jim continued working at the school. The pay was small, but his peace was growing. He stopped thinking about Louis and the mistakes he had made. Every day he told himself, "I am becoming myself again." One evening, as he walked home, he saw a small group of men standing near a shop. They were talking about helping poor workers find jobs. Jim listened quietly. One man said, "We need someone to talk to people, someone who understands struggle." Jim stepped closer and said, "I know what that feels like. I can help." The men looked at him and said, "You? What do you do?" Jim replied, "I was a worker once. I lost everything. But I learned that no one wins alone." The leader of the group smiled and said, "Then come tomorrow. We could use your voice." That night, Jim told Mary, "They want me to speak for them. Maybe I can help others like me." Mary smiled proudly. "You already have, Jim. You helped us." Jim looked at his children sleeping peacefully. He whispered, "They'll never know how close I came to losing myself. But maybe this pain had a purpose, to make me stronger." For the first time, he slept without fear. The next morning, Jim went to meet the workers' group. They welcomed him warmly. One man said, "We'll start with small meetings. You can tell your story." Jim nodded. "I'll tell them that even when life pushes you down, you can still stand again." That day, when he spoke to a small crowd, his voice shook at first. But as he talked about hunger, loss, and hope, the people listened silently. When he finished, they clapped for him. Jim smiled and said, "I'm not rich. I don't have much. But I have something better. Peace." And for the first time, Jim Brown truly felt like a man who had found light after a long, dark road. Chapter 7. The Voice of Hope. Jim Brown's life began to change in quiet ways. He still worked at the school, but now people looked at him differently. The small group of workers who had asked him to speak started meeting every week. They gathered in a simple hall where men and women came to share their problems. Most of them had lost jobs, homes, or faith. Jim listened to every story carefully and always spoke with kindness. He told them, "We may be poor, but we still have voices. If we stand together, the world must listen." His words came from the heart, and people believed him because he spoke like one of them, not above them. Mary often came to the meetings, too. She sat quietly at the back, watching her husband speak. She saw the fire return to his eyes, a light she had not seen for months. After one meeting, she said softly, "You've changed, Jim. You sound stronger now." He smiled gently and replied, "Maybe I finally found what I was meant to do." One afternoon, Mr. Adams, the old school manager, called him aside. He said, "Jim, I've heard about your meetings. You're doing good work, but be careful. People in power don't like when workers talk too loudly." Jim nodded and said, "I understand, sir, but I can't stay silent anymore. Too many people suffer in silence." Mr. Adams sighed and said, "Just remember, courage often comes with a price." The following week, more people came to hear Jim speak. He told them stories of his own mistakes, his hunger, and his shame. "I was once so desperate," he said, "that I forgot who I was. But life gives us chances to rebuild, not just to survive, but to rise." The crowd listened with tears in their eyes. Some clapped, some simply nodded, and some whispered prayers. Jim felt his heart grow lighter each time he spoke. One night, after a long meeting, Mary said, "Do you ever miss the old days when life was simple?" Jim looked at her and answered, "Sometimes. But if I hadn't fallen, I would never have learned how to stand tall." She smiled and said, "You're right. Maybe everything happened for a reason." They sat together in silence, feeling something they hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. But peace did not mean comfort. The group soon began facing challenges. Some rich businessmen complained that Jim was teaching people to rebel. A few even warned him to stop. One day, a man came to his door and said coldly, "You talk too much, Brown. Keep quiet or you'll lose more than your job." Jim looked straight at him and replied calmly, "I've already lost everything once. I'm not afraid anymore." The man left without another word, but Mary's face turned pale. She said, "Jim, what if something happens to you?" He held her hand and said softly, "If I stay silent, something worse will happen to all of us." Despite the fear, Jim kept going. Every meeting grew bigger. Men who once hid in shame now stood up to speak. Women began joining too, sharing their pain and strength. The group slowly turned into a voice of hope for the poor in the city. Mr. Adams came one evening to listen and afterward said, "You've done something I couldn't do, Jim. You gave them faith again." Jim smiled humbly. "They gave me faith first," he replied. Weeks later, a newspaper printed a small story about him. The headline said, "A worker who speaks for the silent." Jim showed it to Mary, and she smiled through her tears. "You see, Jim," she said, "the world needed to hear you." He looked at her with soft eyes and said, "No, Mary. I needed to hear myself again." That night, Jim stood outside his home and looked up at the quiet sky. He thought about everything he had lost and everything he had found. For the first time, he didn't feel poor. He felt full of purpose, of strength, and of peace. He whispered to himself, "When one man finds courage, 1,000 others learn to hope." And from that night on, people didn't just call him Jim Brown the worker. They called him Jim Brown, the man who taught them how to believe again. Chapter 8. The True Victory. The sun rose slowly over the town, and Jim Brown walked toward the small school with quiet steps. Life had changed in ways he never imagined. He was not rich, but he was no longer broken. His heart was full of peace, and his hands were steady again. People now stopped him on the road to say, "Thank you, Jim. You gave us hope." Every time he heard those words, he smiled, not with pride, but with gratitude. He often thought, "I was just a man trying to feed his family." Somehow life turned my pain into a lesson. His group of workers continued to grow. They began helping families find jobs and food. Jim never called himself a leader, but everyone else did. "You gave us a reason to believe again," said one old man after a meeting. Jim shook his head and answered, "No, we found that reason together." The man smiled and said, "Still, it started with you." Those simple words stayed in Jim's heart for a long time. At home, Mary was proud but quiet. One evening she said, "Do you remember the days when we had nothing?" Jim looked at her and said softly, "I remember every day of it. That pain keeps me kind." She touched his hand and whispered, "You've changed, Jim. You've become the man you always wanted to be." He smiled and said, "Maybe I just learned what really matters." But life still tested him. One day, Louis came back after many months. His face looked tired and hard. He stood at Jim's door and said, "I heard you became some kind of hero. I need help." Jim looked at him with calm eyes and said, "Help." Louis nodded slowly. "I have no job, no money. The police are after me." Mary stood behind Jim, afraid of what he might say. But Jim simply opened the door and said, "Come in, Louis." Louis looked shocked. "You're not angry?" he asked. Jim said quietly, "I was angry once, but anger never fed my children. Sit down." Louis sat in silence. Jim poured him some water and said, "Everyone can change. You helped me see what I never want to become. Now, it's your turn to start over." For a moment, Louis couldn't speak. His voice finally broke. "I don't deserve your kindness." Jim replied, "Maybe not, but I know what it's like to be lost. Kindness saved me once. It can save you too." That night, after Louis left, Mary said, "You forgave him. I never thought you would." Jim looked at her and said, "If I can't forgive, then I'm no better than who I was before. She smiled gently and said, "You've won, Jim." He shook his head. "No, Mary, I haven't won. I just learned that peace is better than revenge." Weeks later, Jim's story spread beyond their town. A group of people from another city invited him to speak at a large hall. When he stood on the stage, he felt nervous. He looked at the crowd and said, "I am not a great man. I am just one of you. I have failed, fallen, and lost everything. But I learned something. We don't need wealth to be rich. We need courage, honesty, and love. If we have that, no one can take away our peace." The hall became silent, and then the people began to clap. Some cried, some held hands. Jim smiled through his tears. When he returned home that night, Mary was waiting at the door. She said, "How did it go?" He replied softly, "They listened, Mary. They really listened." She hugged him and said, "Then your journey is complete." Jim looked at her with kind eyes and said, "No, Mary. My journey will never end. As long as someone loses hope, my voice must stay alive." Years later, people still spoke his name with respect. They told stories of how he once walked through hunger and pain, but never stopped believing in goodness. Jim never became a rich man, but he gave others something more valuable than money: the strength to live with dignity. And so, the man who once stood on the edge of despair became the voice of hope for many. His greatest victory was not the job he found, the crowd he led, or the respect he earned. His true victory was the peace he carried inside, the peace that comes when a man chooses to do right, even when life gives him every reason not to.